See, I'm from northern British Columbia, but I've, for the last 3.5 years, been living and working on the Sunshine Coast. It's a great name, which is on the east coast of Australia, in Queensland, but actually that's where Peter's from, so it's kind of a nice connection. Peter grew up in Gympie, which is on the north part of the coast, but you can liken the coast kind of surfer mecca. So it was totally new for me or any of us going to from the north to the south, and yeah, Peter can attest to that, right? It's kind of like Shangri-La, you know, sandy beaches, bathing suits. I know. 28 degrees, the mall, yeah, okay, no. Actually, no, I'm pleased to be here today. My name is Tristan Pearce. I'm a senior research fellow in the Sustainability Research Centre at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. But I'm also adjunct faculty in the Department of Geography at the University of Guelph. And a lot of my work is for ArcticNet is actually paired upon two projects. One that I co-lead with Dr. James Ford on community vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience in the Arctic. And several people in this room contribute to that, including David and others in this room, Genevieve, Linnea, Elizabeth, and so on. As well as working with Dr. Lisa Lassetto and others on the co-production of knowledge for beluga whale. So a lot of projects going on, and they all kind of come together. And today what I want to do is I want to focus on one element that's kind of cross-cutting across all these projects. That's the role and importance of, for lack of a better term, traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, or Inuit Quadrigemerjumiat IQ, the role and importance of those knowledge systems in adaptation to climate change, particularly when it comes to the subsistence hunting sector. What I want to do is I want to start actually at the global scale. I think a lot of times at ArcticNet and in Arctic research, we're very insular. We often talk about what's happening in the Arctic. We draw lines. Myself, most of my research and the research of our colleagues is highly localized. The reason for that is because we know that climate change impacts, as well as human adaptation, are highly localized. They're influenced by exogenous and endogenous features, geography, humans' past experience with change, local capacities, and so on. But when we start talking about adaptation and adaptation policy and intervention, it's important to link to that global picture because there's similarities across the globe that Inuits share with Indigenous peoples worldwide, as well as with non-Indigenous people. And I put this up here because in Paris in 2015, something significant happened. In Paris, now for those, I should give a little preface, COP is the Conference of the Parties. It is the climate negotiations at the global scale where they're negotiating amongst nations. So this is at the government, federal, state level for both mitigating and adapting to climate change. So in Paris in 2015 at COP21, and that number 21 will be significant, so just remember that number for a second. It was a big deal because the 2015 Paris Agreement and implementing decisions included actually 5, and this is really kind of the first time it was really explicit, 5 explicit references to Indigenous peoples, their rights, and traditional knowledge. Now, notably, the agreement states, and I think I should read this one because it's probably the most striking aspect of the agreement. Quote, parties, those are the countries, acknowledge that adaptation action should follow a country-driven. Okay, so recognizing that, you know, in Canada we have sovereignty over our actions, so country-driven, so this should be a nationally driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, taking into consider, again, lack for a better word, vulnerable groups, or for more like sensitive groups, communities, ecosystems, and should be based on and guided by the best available science, and as appropriate, here it is, Devin, help me out, and traditional knowledge. And we think here, we talk about this all the time, this is the first explicit recognition of this at a global climate change meeting. So here we are, back to, and knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems with a view of integrating adaptation into relevant socioeconomic and environmental policies and actions, things like co-management boards, where appropriate. So you can find that in the Paris Agreement. Now, this is significant because all of a sudden now we have different ways of knowing. We're not just going on that Western ontology. We're actually acknowledging that there's other ways of understanding climate governance. Now in Paris, this was good because it was the acknowledgement that Indigenous and traditional knowledge play a role. But what it did is it set a platform for the discussion on how you actually do this. But it really falls short on how to operationalize this. What role does traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous knowledge play in climate governance? And then the big question is, well, how do you even include this? There's several talks and posters at this ArcticNet which are seeking to do that, bridging, blending, including both Indigenous knowledge systems and science. There's not a lot of guidance on how you do that, which comes first, questions of equity and so on and so forth. So this year, just recently at the Conference of the Parties, number 22, I say that because it's been 22 years. It's taken us 22 years to get here. In Marrakesh, Morocco, where myself and Dr. James Ford and Ian Morrow and others were working with UNESCO on the Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Working Group, which is a big question is on how you actually do this. How do you include meaningfully Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge in the climate governance process? So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take it from an Arctic perspective, because what I proposed in Marrakesh was that this is really, it's old news when it comes to the Arctic. This is something that's an age-old story. It's more recent in the research. But for a long time, traditional knowledge has helped facilitate Inuit and other Northerners cope with, adapt to, have success and prosperity in with relatively a hard environment. Now, for most of the work that we've done on climate change adaptation, when we focus on subsistence, the reason is it's that close relationship that people have with the environment that makes them sensitive to changes. This is an image of Adam Kudlak and Ilhakto, just again highlighting, the activity on the ice, changes in the ice. You have changes in the ice that's going to affect travel, change the ice affect the species you hunt, and so on and so forth. But what we've seen is an extremely high adaptability. So rather than calling it vulnerable, we call it sensitive, because Inuit have demonstrated, continue to demonstrate, they're not victims of climate change, but they're actually active players in engaging with that environment and adapting. And in this case, as David gave examples, and then there's several other, when changes happen in the environment, people aren't just passive, they don't just lie down. They actively engage and respond to that. There's a lot of innovation in that process, and much of that innovation is grounded in those knowledge systems, which up to now have really been neglected at that global adaptation policy level. And really what we want to focus on, and I hate to compartmentalize it, so I won't, is this concept of traditional ecological knowledge. Some people call it cultural knowledge, because of course that word traditional uses a vernacular, infers old, and really we know it's not old knowledge. So if we take, say, the GNWT, the Government of the Northwest Territories, an adapted definition of traditional knowledge, it would go something like this. It'd be a body of knowledge, skills, values that is accumulated through observation, hands-on practices with the environment, and it's transmitted through oral traditions and experiences. So this body of knowledge, it's not just the skills, it's not just the observations, but it's really housed in the larger ontology. Okay, so that's the value system that goes behind it. And that's important as we move forward about that question of, well then, how do you engage with this knowledge system? So what I'm trying to show here is what Nunavut has already done, and they've already grounded this in their definition of IQ, in that TEK is beyond just knowledge and use of the environment. And that's fine if you want to take that aspect of it and use it, but we need to acknowledge that it's grounded in a larger cosmology. Okay? It's grounded with a larger value system. And if it's divorced from that, it's not really the same thing. We need to take it holistically. I'll show you some examples. So this paper we published in Arctic last year was looking at the role and importance of TEK in adaptation, and I'll give you some examples. So the first example of where TEK explicitly plays a role in adaptation is flexibility and innovation in response to change. So in this case, we have an Inuit hunter, Ilhakto, out in a small open water boat in the middle of February when you expect it to be frozen, and they've been innovative. They're able to adapt the way they engage with the environment. So rather than taking a snowmobile, you take the snowmobile to the ice edge, you're in a small open water boat, and you're going to still retrieve your seal. The end goal is you're still going to be able to subside, you're going to take meat home, you're just doing it in a different way. Flexibility comes up across the board. It's nothing new. It's grounded in the historical adaptation. It's really underpinning adaptation to current changes. Another example would be hazard avoidance. So, when people encounter hazards, again, it's not just a victim experience. It's about how you deal with them. What we see with Inuit across the board, and again, drawing from Ilhakto, is that with that knowledge of wayfinding, The knowledge of the weather, it's always adapting. So that's one of the key points is traditional ecological knowledge is dynamic. It's the uptake of new information, adapting it with the old. So, those that have contested that traditional knowledge is becoming irrelevant because the climate is changing, I totally disagree. It's adapting and molding, it's adjusting, it's the uptake of new information and experiences so that they can cope with new challenges like climate changes. Great example is there's been an uptake of new technologies. We see younger hunters, unexperienced hunters, traveling using GPS, again, the uptake of radio, new technologies. But what you see time and time again is when those equipment, those technologies fail, it's the underpinning knowledge of the environment of wayfinding that really facilitates adaptation. You see this across the board as far as people getting out of trouble, usually relying on that underpinning knowledge system. That's imperative. Now there's emergency preparedness. If you're interested in this, you can look at Dylan Clark's poster and research, which is, with traditional ecological knowledge, it's knowledge of what you take on the land. And in many instances, you're taking more supplies, extra supplies. You're traveling with more precautions because there is uncertainty in the ice and the weather. But again, this is grounded in having knowledge and understanding of that system itself. So again, 3 examples, so flexibility, innovation, hazard avoidance, emergency preparedness. So where do we go with this? So if we're looking at adaptation policy, I would argue that rather than focusing on addressing climate change per se, most successful adaptations are directed at non-climatic issues. In this case, I'd say facilitating the generation and transmission of traditional ecological knowledge, which inadvertently supports adaptation. It goes back to that idea of building a foundation of wellness, which then inadvertently provides people with the ability to draw on historical adaptation practices. It's the foundation of society, and they're able then to cope with the challenges that are before them. So what I mean by that is, if you have shoreline erosion, rather than building a seawall, or if you have limitation to country food, rather than shipping up more food, that's where you have climate change and then a direct response. I'm saying that sometimes you have to look at climate change adaptation a little bit differently. And in this case, this picture is from a program called Nunnaminilihabia, Learning from the Land, where Health Canada acknowledged this. And the community said, look, what would support our needs for adaptation is we want our young guys to get out on the land, particularly in the winter, for winter seal hunting. There's been a break in transmission when there was the ban on the importation of seal products to the US. And look, this is something that we hold dear to not only Subsistence, but also to our identity. So let's have some funding to connect skilled teachers with younger people. And this is exactly what happened. And in particular, they're interested in not just getting people out for 1 or 2 times, but they're interested in developing the depth of knowledge. So again, it's important when we talk about these knowledge systems is that, yes, somebody can drive a skidoo and go shoot an animal, but that's just the action. There's so much more behind it. It's knowledge of where that animal is. Why is that a good place for that animal to be? And then all the different values and actions that happen afterwards. How you treat that animal, what you do with the meat, things like payutak or the sharing processes that are integral to that knowledge system. And give you just a quick example, and if it's something that intrigues you, you can look at a paper in Human Ecology that myself and my colleagues wrote in 2011, which did an empirical analysis of knowledge transmission amongst Inuit men. And what these numbers show, the first ones are the really young guys, the next ones are 34 to 49, and the next ones are people over 50. As far as answering these questions, where do you hunt caribou and why? What you see is that depth of knowledge is lacking sometimes in the younger generation, and it's often being neglected through some of those programs that are attached to the school, like the trapping or hunting programs, which means that there needs to be an emphasis on the generation of this knowledge and the transmission. And just a couple great images of some of the key skills teachers that are doing this. So this is Robert Kuptana in Ilahakto. We have Mabel Inario. She's the star of a poster as well, teaching the Gihimiak chews, so the bearded seal, the Ugyu, how to chew. And this is all part of, again, Health Canada, climate change adaptation, but the community convinced them that by funding programs like sewing and the transmission of knowledge between elders and youth, this inadvertently is preparing people to deal with the changes that they're not only facing now, but will face. And then also just the emphasis on the value of language. And this is something that's different in the West. And those of you from the Nubia region would probably agree with me that, look, ArcticNet's focused on the Slavics and the Nukuta, but there's other languages. If you're from Inuvik, Inuvialuktun. If you're from Ilahakto, you speak Inuinnaqtun. And the value of those languages and actually the importance of those languages for transmitting knowledge. Much of the knowledge that's held by these individuals is the detail that's captured in language. And there's been limited focus on language when it comes to talking about adaptation. So again, non-climactic specific, but a very realistic, Inuit-driven, identified concern that we can link to this idea of adaptation. Key message, the big take-home message, not only for the Arctic, but also for the global community, is that climate change adaptation policy should be built on existing knowledge and practices of adaptation. The idea of Inuit knowledge systems and Inuit ways of doing it happened long before researchers went and started talking about it. This is about reinforcing and supporting what's already there. And finally, I'd just like to make a last note just to thank Peter, thank the people of Winnipeg. It's a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to meeting with you during the rest of the day. Thank you.
This is the last talk, and one of the privileges of being the last speaker is you can take questions into the coffee break. But please, if anyone feels free, like to leave a coffee, feel free, but I'm sure Tristan
no one wants to
answer questions. Just giving them the option.
Peter, please.
Question.
Hi. I have a question. Is there such a thing like a survey where you collect all these kind of knowledges, different areas or whatever, and have some examples where you try to adapt the knowledge to something we could basically use and adapt to our research? Something like that?
You make a really good point. Well, the first is that, a lot of people do cataloging, recording, et cetera, of different knowledge systems, but I don't necessarily do that. What I've tried to do is integrate it into the decision-making process. So a great example would be the work on beluga whale in Nunavut. Okay, so and you can see some posters of this, where for decades, Department of Fisheries and Oceans and others has had beluga monitoring program where they use Western scientific measurements, and it's always empirical. And more recently, there's a recognition that they really don't know a lot about beluga under changing conditions. So there's been a greater effort to not only recognize, but also to include, to empower in the decision-making process. Other forms of knowing, Inuit traditional knowledge, Inuit traditional knowledge, and in doing so, bringing to light the two knowledge systems, showing the complementary aspects of it, but integrating that into management. So there's one example, and there's posters on that and papers, where with beluga, they're trying to broker the two systems. Yeah. But there's not necessarily any one, catalog where you can go to. But
maybe not
yeah.
a specific example, but something which can reach out, maybe us, to actually, cooperate together with the culture to actually implement these things actually in research.
I think people are making the effort. I think actually one of the good challenges, one that I'm trying to work on right now, is that question: how do you include other knowledge systems with Western science for decision making? I think it's an open challenge. People are trying, but I don't think we got it quite right yet.
I was just wondering if someone is working on it or,
Well, the Game Council works on it, yeah.
So this is the ISR. We made the first steps of actually creating a database of a TEK catalog, cataloging the TEK work that's already been done, so for researchers to be able to go and at least figure out what has been collected in the past and be able to access it from the people that hold it. That's the first step. Yeah, so we're working on developing that, and we have it actually in the first pages.
That's so great that you all agree with this. This is perfect. So, federal government, excellent. Provincial.
Any other questions? Any questions for previous speakers who might be still in the room before we break? No? Okay. Well, thanks very much to all the speakers. I'm sure everyone will be happy to talk to you later over coffee.